You're listening to Procurement 6, the weekly podcast from the team at Art of Procurement that summarizes this week in procurement in just 6 short segments.
Hi there, I'm Helen Mackenzie and today is Friday, March 1st, 2024.
6.
This week's episode of Procurement 6 is brought to you by the Institute of Commercial Payments. For commercial card and payment professionals, staying on top of the latest best practices and networking with colleagues has never been more essential. For an in-person event that balances educational opportunities and social connections, join the Institute of Commercial Payments as they host their 25th Commercial Card and Payment Conference from April 29th to May 1st in Las Vegas, Nevada. Already confirmed speakers include representatives from the Federal Reserve, Hewlett-Packard and Cox Communications. Click on the link in today's show notes to view the full agenda, an up-to-date list of speakers and to register for the event.
5.
I had the pleasure of meeting Reda Geary, Head of Group Outsourcing and Procurement at Toyota Insurance Services Europe at ProcureCon EU last year. So I was delighted to hear his interview with Philip Eidson in a recent Art of Procurement podcast episode. Now the conversation is about approaching an old problem for procurement using a new approach called nemawashi. Now, nemawashi is a Japanese term that describes a specific method for consensus building and communicating with stakeholders during times of change or significant decision making. In this episode, Phil and Reda talk about how procurement can use the nemawashi method to drive better results and some of the benefits that this approach can bring to procurement and the business in general. Let's take a listen.
What are the benefits do you see of applying the methodology?
Well, the first thing is, I say this, I'm going to repeat it again. It takes a long time. It's not Barbie world. I mean, but then once you have done it, when you have had the consistency and discipline, patience to go through it, once you have that final decision, quite often that final decision is really final.
Okay.
It sounds quite basic, but
it's kind of generally accepted that, okay, now I've got to accept that decision. Because one of the things I was going to ask is, like, how do you avoid, you're asking a lot of people different opinions. And so there's going to be a lot of people who are disappointed when perhaps the final product doesn't represent the opinions that they had. And, you know, managing the ability to avoid, you know, get buy-in when you make a final decision and avoid it just being kind of decision by committee, which, you know, can be sometimes very hard to make final decisions around.
Well, absolutely. I mean, first thing, we're talking about considering different opinions.
Yeah.
But please don't get me wrong, we're not saying agreeing with every person. It's really impossible. It's not. There's this saying that if you want to make everyone happy, you will end up with a very average product.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, it's not about agreement. It's about alignment and agreeing on disagreements also respectfully.
Yeah. Okay, so nemawashi isn't an easy way out for procurement to avoid difficult conversations. As Reda tells us, it can often be a long and hard process of having conversations with every single stakeholder multiple times before a final decision or plan is made, and making sure that everyone's voice has been heard along the way. But on the back end of all that work is total alignment and total buy-in from every stakeholder. And that can save procurement and the business a lot of headaches and retrofitting in the long run, making it well worth all the effort. Listen to the full episode. Go to artofprocurement.com/podcast or search for Art of Procurement and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or click on the link in today's show notes.
4.
Is just-in-time inventory a relic of the past or a secret weapon fit for the future? In this week's episode of Art of Supply, Kelly Barner digs into the surprising history of this strategy, from its grocery store roots to its global impact. She uncovers the hidden benefits and challenges, especially in today's turbulent supply chain environment. Join Kelly as she unpacks the future of just-in-time and explore if it can be revived responsibly in a world that's anything but predictable. Make sure you listen in to the podcast.
This is Procurement 6 from Art of Procurement. To get notified every time an episode is published, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. 3.
I had the pleasure of connecting with Pontoon Solutions Phil Knott recently on a call where our conversation was all about the contingent labour category and the options that are available to meet that need, including managed service providers or MSPs. I was interested to discover from Phil that the MSP market is experiencing significant growth, with projections pointing towards substantial expansion in the coming years. According to industry reports, the global market size is expected to reach $731.8 billion by 2030, growing at a compound annual rate of 13.6% from 2023 to 2030. Wow, that's some rate of growth. To remain agile and meet business objectives, employers are engaging and hiring more temporary and contract workers to supplement their workforce, and procurement are front and centre of the process. Now, Phil's written a really interesting article on the topic that's definitely worth a read. You can find a link to the piece in the show notes.
2.
In the second episode of the Love Procurement podcast, I Value as Stephen Carter shares some modern lessons pulled from the history of procurement. Now, I first met Stephen Carter at a CPO roundtable where he gave a presentation on the history of procurement in the auspicious surroundings of the Cavalry and Guards Club in central London. Now, it was a very fitting venue for such a talk, and Stephen's knowledge of the history of procurement was very impressive. So, if you fancy going back in time, check out this week's episode of Love Procurement. I can't wait to hear more as Kelly Barner and Stephen look back as far as the 17th century and draw parallels from history that we can use in the present day. Check out the link to the podcast in the show notes.
1.
Most procurement organisations use their P2P or ERP platforms to facilitate procurement intake, triage and coordination. Now, these are important and powerful tools, but often they're not perfect. Some don't easily integrate with other tools, and approval processes that rely on them can remain complex, arduous with long cycle times. And that's because these platforms are typically designed for the procurement team and not for the end users. Now, here at Art of Procurement, we know what matters most when it comes to creating business value is the experience that procurement provides. And the good news is we're discovering that this improved experience is possible through an AI-powered process called orchestration. I'm looking forward to finding out more at our next AOP Live webinar, which takes place on March the 12th, where Tonkin's co-founder and CEO Sagi Eliyahu and Hackett Group's Jonathan Faring join us to review use cases that show the potential of putting the experience first when it comes to orchestrating procurement processes and workflows across teams and systems. Register now by going to artofprocurement.com/calendar or by using the link in the show notes.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Friday at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. If you've enjoyed this pod, help us grow and tell your peers to search for Procurement 6 wherever they get their podcasts.